Welcome back to video number 4 of which Bible version should I use? And this one's exciting to me because this is where we get practical. Okay, we've taken the things that we've learned and we're going to talk about what do we do with this. Now, if you haven't watched my other 3 videos, please look in the links below and go back and watch them. We talk about why, we talk about the things behind our thought process in this and how we actually choose the Bible version that we choose. So I'm just going to actually show you this right now in case it's been a while since you watched the other ones. Why do we have differences in Bible translations? And there's 2 reasons: the underlying text and methods of translation. We talk about those in somewhat detail in the previous video, so go back and watch those, and because this last one won't make quite as much sense. So how do I choose which Bible version to use? As far as the underlying text goes, some people will swear by the Textus Receptus or the Byzantine text, basically about the same thing as far as the New Testament goes. Some people say, well, no, you can use other texts too, Alexandrian, whatever, critical text, those kinds of things. And then the methods of translation, some people say, well, it always should be formal, or they might even use the word literal. It might even use the word for word, which isn't really correct, as we've seen. Or some might say, well, it needs to be more dynamic. It needs to be more of a punch. You need to really get the feeling from reading it. What is my recommendation? I'm going to share this with you right now. And this is where it's a little more controversial. I don't mean for it to be that way, but this is where I came down on it, and maybe it'll help you a little bit. Here it is right here. Choose the translation that is closest to formal equivalence that you can understand. Okay? When it's closest to formal equivalence that you can understand. Now, that's going to differ between some people. Some people can understand just about anything you read. And I think if you really put your mind to it, you can understand more than you do. Don't consider yourself dumb. Well, I can't understand that. Well, give it a try, for goodness sakes. Try. Don't let people tell you that you can't do it, okay? So if you really put your mind to it, most people could actually read about any Bible version. I mean, people read Shakespeare all the time. Now, personally, I don't get a whole lot out of that, but, people can read that stuff. But so you can read the Bible. All right, you can read the Bible. But try to get one as formally equivalent, but you need to be able to understand it too. All right. Now, what you understand, like I said, will actually differ between different people. When I grew up using the King James Version, and most of the time, if I quote Bible, I'm going to quote out of the KJV. I might change from the and thou to a you or whatever. It sounds very New King Jamesy, right? If I just change that, but that's what I usually quote from because that's what I know. But my personal opinion, if you watch my videos, I usually use the New King James Version, and this is the reason for that. I can understand the King James in a lot of ways, but I also want, when I'm preaching from the pulpit, I want to give it in a language that people understand, because the Bible was written everyday language for the most part. And I want people not to come into church and think, well, this is high church, this is Shakespearean, this is something or whatever, and I don't understand that. So I want people to get it, right? And so I'm staying as close to formally equivalent as I can, but I think the New King James is very easy to understand. And so that's where I stand. And some of you might have difference of opinion, and I don't think this is something worth fighting about, my opinion. Obviously, some people do, and that's fine. I mean, if you studied it all out and you come to a real strong conclusion that, the NASB is the only one or the King James is the only one, if you actually understand it, that's fine. That's fine. But I'm giving you my thoughts in this video, right? And you clicked on it, hopefully for that reason. So choose the translation as the closest to formal equivalence that you can understand. But keep in mind when you read this that over time, words change meanings. Here's some examples I just wrote down. In John 3:8, in the King James, it says, "The wind bloweth where it listeth." Now, I never questioned, I always heard that growing up, that I knew what it meant. And I've always been in church, so, I was able to decipher through some of this. But we don't usually use bloweth where it listeth. I mean, it just means the wind blows wherever it wants to go, right? But some people might say, what? I don't get it, okay? Maybe you want to look at a version that says it just a little bit differently. One example we have is 2 Timothy 2:15. We just have to understand this. I grew up in Awana. I know 2 Timothy 2:15. Study to show thyself approved to God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. All my life I've heard this. We had to memorize it, right? But the word study there, study to show thyself approved to God. We think, oh, it means I need to sit down with my Awana book, and I grew up in Pals and Pioneers, right? And I need to study my Awana because that's what it means. Well, that word actually doesn't mean to sit down and look at a book and learn from it. It means to make haste or be diligent. Studying in English might be part of that, but he's not just saying sit down and get some book learning. What he's saying is be diligent to show yourself approved to God. And you don't get that from the King James necessarily, unless you study it out a little bit. And that's one of the things, you have to look at these words and try to understand them a little more. And so just things to keep in mind if you choose a more formally equivalent translation, which I recommend as formally equivalent as you possibly can. Like I said, my favorite is the New King James. And there's some words, growing up with the King James, which obviously I'm not bashing at all. I think it's awesome. I think it's great. But there were some other things that brought me to my conclusions. One is, there's some words in it that I just don't say, right? Look up Hebrews 12:8, okay? Talking about illegitimate children. Well, it uses a term that I don't use, and frankly, I don't want to read that from the pulpit. Because there are other English words that mean exactly the same thing. Illegitimate children means exactly the same thing. And so I would rather be reading something that I can actually read. 1 Samuel 25:22, if you want to go look that up. And the same word appears 5 other places. There's a word that you could translate it urinate. It means exactly the same thing. But there's a different word in the King James, and it's a word that I'm just frankly not going to say from the pulpit. Okay, so I'm going to read in something else. 2 Peter 2:16. I much prefer talking about Balaam's dumb donkey than his dumb bleep, okay, because I just don't use that terminology ever, not even referring to what somebody else says. And so there's things like that have, maybe they weren't as big a deal to say it that way back in the 16 to 1700s, but in our language today, we just don't say it. And I don't want anyone to hear those words coming out of my mouth. It's not that it was wrong for them to put it in there. It's just that in today's society, we don't say it that way. All right. And we can say another word that means exactly the same thing. And like I said, one of the reasons that I came down where I did on this is that, I want people to understand that the Bible is a book for you. It's a book that you can read. And it's not just for a higher class or higher educated people or whatever like that. So I want to actually show this one more time to our graphic, if I can get it up for you. Remember a graphic, formal equivalence on one side and dynamic equivalence on the other. The more formal equivalent is going to be a little bit harder to read, but I'll bet you if you try, you'll be able to get it. Just try, study, use a dictionary, right? You can do that. More dynamic equivalent, I'll look at those a lot of times. Sometimes I'll look at things like the NIV and the New Living Translation just to say, okay, give me another take on what you think. What do these translators think about it? Just helps me know if I'm way off base on something. So that's how I do it. And you have to use it your way. And I mentioned the New King James, which I do like myself. How was it translated? Okay, we call it a more formal equivalent translation, but really in the preface to the New King James, they use the term complete equivalence. And I'm just going to read you a short quote from the preface. Talking about complete equivalence, it says, this principle of complete equivalence seeks to preserve all of the information in the text while presenting it in good literary form. Okay, that was what they tried to do. Everything in there, try to be as literal as they possibly could, but still make a good literary form where you can actually read it in English and it makes sense. And then it also says if the New King James Version follows the historic precedent of the Authorized Version, that's the KJV, in maintaining a literal approach to translation, except where the idiom of the original language cannot be translated directly into our tongue. So they'll take some of these idioms where it just simply doesn't make sense in English, and they'll change it to something else in English. So it means the same thing, and you actually get it, okay? And often in the New King James, they'll actually mark, some things like that. So in the end, I just want to leave you with this. You can spend lots of time arguing about this. And for some people, this is the basis of Christianity. Okay, and I get that. I understand. But I have maybe a more serious question. And that is, do you actually read the Bible? And do you actually obey it? Or do you spend all your time arguing about it? some of the most hateful people that I've ever known, and people I would really put in the ungodly category, how they treat their families, and how they complain and how they gossip. Some of those people have been the strongest on the Bible version debate. All they want to do is fight about that. And if they really believe that, that's completely fine. But it's almost like sometimes what I believe about Bible versions, and it can be anywhere on the whole spectrum. Okay, I'm not just talking about, KJV only or whatever. It can be anybody. This is it. But they're not living it. They're not living any translation. The Bible says to do things and they show up in every translation, but I can be mean and I can be hateful, but I've got this issue right. I think we need to understand all this about it, but we need to make sure that we are reading it and obeying it. Are you reading it and are you obeying it? God gave you the Bible for you to read and for you to obey. So just do it. I hope this has been a blessing to you. And I would be interested if you had any comments on it. I'd love to hear it. And by the way, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, just hit that subscribe button. It would just be great. I'd be grateful for it. And hit the like button on this video, share it or whatever. The YouTube is just, how it goes. The more interaction there is with videos, the more it starts showing up on people's feed. And I want people to see these things, and hopefully they'll help them a little bit. So do that if you haven't. And God bless you guys, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.